Hey everyone, so this is the last lesson before our chapter 5 test. I love this meme. It may not mean anything to you, but it's so true, and that's why we're doing some review today on negative reinforcement, positive, punishment, all those kinds of things. Most of the time people really confuse negative reinforcement with punishment, and they mean two different things. Reinforcement is a positive thing, even though it has the word negative in front of it, just means takeaway. So I'm going to go through the review really quickly. I'm going to go through reinforcement schedules and go through that review as well. And then get to the contemporary researchers and then observational things and talk to you about the rest of the unit here, okay? So this first example was conditioned stimulus because Mrs. Snarley is not normally somebody that would naturally have caused Blair to feel the way she did, especially in the grocery store. So she's a conditioned or learned stimulus. And then for this, we naturally shiver. So that's a reflexive kind of natural response to cold temperatures. So the cold temperature in this scenario is the unconditioned stimulus because it naturally causes people to shiver, which shivering would be the unconditioned response. And then this is an example of taste aversion, right? The first time you eat sushi, you get terrible food poisoning, and then every single time you see raw fish or rice, you feel sick. So the feeling of being sick is a conditioned response because looking at fish before, raw fish did not make you sick, but because you were conditioned to feel that way, you are. And what's the smell of rice and sight of fish? That's going to be the conditioned stimulus. So now that becomes a learned stimulus and also a learned response. Okay, and then also in the review was things about reinforcement and punishment. I'm doing this because it literally is one of the most important things to grasp, and you really need to understand it and not get confused. The best thing to do when you're going into these kind of issues and questions, and the questions I asked you for the conditioned stimulus and also for negative and positive punishments and reinforcements, they are very similar, not the exact same, but very similar to the types of questions I would ask you on the test. So going through them actually helps you to actually do good on the exam. So when you're looking at these, what you first want to say is, are we trying to stop behavior or are we trying to continue behavior? If you're trying to continue behavior, you're reinforcing. If you're trying to stop behavior, you're trying to punish, okay? Then you have to ask yourself, am I adding something or taking something away? Adding is positive and negative is taking something away. Negative reinforcement is still we're trying to maintain behavior, but it's a positive outcome, even though it says the word negative and reinforcement. Remember I said we need to kind of rework how we think about these particular words. So in this example, it's positive reinforcement. Ruben's telling a joke and he got that reinforcement. He got the fact that people laughed and he liked the feeling of that. So everyone laughing at his jokes is a positive reinforcement. He wants to continue the behavior and something's added, it's the laughter because it is a reward, just like a sticker would be in a classroom. And then this one about Janet coming home and she's the loss of her driving privileges. This is a negative punishment. Her parents want to stop the behavior of being late, so that's punishment, and they're taking away something, so that's negative. And then Terry keeps interrupting the teacher during spelling, so the teacher is going to make him write words 10 times. For the extra homework is going to be a positive punishment. And again, even those two words don't seem like they're going together, in psychology, that's how we talk about reinforcement and punishment. So the teacher's trying to stop Terry's behavior of interrupting, so that's punishment. And adding something is writing the extra words, so that's positive, so positive punishment. And then the last one, Dave has a splitting headache. He goes for a run and magically the headache disappears. So the disappearance of the headache is related to negative reinforcement. So he wants to continue that activity of running because it is taking away his headache. So that takeaway. So and medicine's the same way, like taking aspirin or anything like that is all negative reinforcement. This is very similar. Let's think about why you do not speed when you are driving, okay? When you do not speed when you're driving, you feel really good about that because you haven't been pulled over by the police and you've broken a law like speeding. So that's also negative reinforcement. You are driving the speed limit to avoid getting a speed ticket, that's negative reinforcement. You want to continue that behavior, and you're taking away the opportunity of getting a speeding ticket. Okay? So those are really important to review and continue to do that. If you have questions, let me know. Here's what we're going to do next is going over the schedules of reinforcement. So when we do this, and part of your unit project is going to be using these schedules, so that's one other way you're going to reinforce what you know. So when we talk about schedules of reinforcement, there's a response rate, the rate in which the behavior repeats, and the extinction rate. I'm going to show you kind of what they're like, so then you can decide in the project what you want to actually use. There's two types of reinforcement. There's continuous, so it happens after every response or behavior. It's followed by the reinforcer. And here we're talking about positive reinforcers, things that are given as a way to continue the behavior, and one that's added. So those pellets, those food pellets, that's all positive reinforcement that Skinner was doing. Partial is the occurrence of specific behaviors, and sometimes they're followed by a response and sometimes they're not. So for instance, in the book, it talks about basketball, that every time you throw a basketball up to the hoop, you don't get it in, but you continue because you know eventually you will get it in, and that will get that reinforcement, especially when you start getting it even more because you practice, you start getting a better reinforcer there. So continuous reinforcement is the most efficient way to train somebody to do something. The response rate, though, is slow, and the extension is pretty fast. So partial reinforcement is what really starts to show some residual where you don't lose, that extinction doesn't accelerate. And it's really more realistic, okay? Most of us do not get instantaneous gratitude or reinforcers after everything we do, and that makes it more realistic and so forth. The reason why the rats were responding, increasing the bar, was because they really know that if they're persistent, eventually they're going to get something. Another example of partial reinforcement is where people wearing a lucky shirt. In the book, it talked about LeBron James also as athletes. They have their little ritual that they do before they either do a free throw, or I know Ricky Fowler used to have this lining up to a golf ball, and he would do all this stuff. He'd go away from the ball like 5 or 6 times. You're like, just hit it. But that is their routine. And when they do that, some of the time they hit their shot correctly, and sometimes they don't. But when they do, it reinforces what they're doing, so they continue to do that. Just like wearing a lucky shirt to a game where Colts are losing, you wear your lucky shirt every single time, but then all of a sudden they win, you're like, oh, I'm going to wear my lucky shirt next time as well. So it's kind of like that accidental one. Okay, let's go over the schedules, and then we'll go over the examples I gave you. So fixed ratio and is fixed and also based on behavior. What you need to remember is ratio is based, it is the example giving you an example about behavior guiding it, or is it time? Time is interval and ratio is behavior. So fixed ratio is I'm looking at behaviors guiding the reinforcement. So positive reinforcement is given after a fixed number. So a lot of behavior, and then there's a pause. This one really goes with burst, pause, burst. So if I look at my example, in blue there, the fixed ratio of 10, if the rat presses the bar 10 times, then they get a reward. So it's fixed ratio 10. And 10 represents behavior, which is ratio, and that's how many times that they're hitting the bar, and then they get a reward. And what you find is they're hitting the bar 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and they wait for the reward, okay? And then they'll hit 1, 2, 3, 4. So it's a burst of that, and then a pause for the reward, a burst and a pause. So that's what that looks. And you can see it's the purple line on the right there that we see this kind of, fast response rate and then a medium extinction rate. The other thing would be example, every 100 envelopes you get paid $1. Okay, so the fixed ratio for that is on envelopes. It's being guided by then what you do. So 100 envelopes, then you get the reward. Okay, so that's fixed ratio. Variable ratio is also based on behavior, but now you're varying how many of the behavior you need to have in order to get that reward. So for instance, it's trial by trial. So rats get food pellets after pressing the bar 25 times the first time, and then 15 the second time, maybe 10 the third time, and then 30. And what it averages out to be is 20. So if you average all the number of times they hit that bar, then you take the average, and that's where you get a variable ratio of 20. Gambling is the same way. And that variable ratio works the same way. They're pulling the slot machine, pulling the slot machine. Oh, then they get a reward. That maybe they did that 10 times. Then the second time they pull it 20 times, then they get some coins. Then they did it 5 times, get some coins. It all varies in the how many times you have to actually do the behavior for you to get that reinforcement. And so you see variable ratio, it's really quick too. Fast response rate because they keep, pressing here until they get a reward. And the extinction rate's pretty slow. So that works pretty good for lack of extinction. Now intervals are all about time. So you're going to see the opposite now. It's not going to be behavior varying and being fixed. It's going to be the time. So for instance, for this one, a fixed interval, of 2, the rat presses a bar as many times as it can. It just keeps pressing it, but it's only after 2 minutes that it will get that reinforcer. Okay. For instance, if a fixed interval 4, studying for a test every 4 weeks. As the test gets closer, we start to study a little bit more as we get to that 4-week mark. So the time in which the reinforcer will be given is set. It's fixed. Okay. And it's interval because it's changing of time. It's being based on time. Okay. And you can see it there. It's kind of a straight line, medium, extinction, so forth, medium, and you sort of get this. Okay. It doesn't matter what you do in the time frame. You're still, you're only getting a reinforcer. You're only getting something happening right at that fixed mark. So that's why it makes it a nice straight line. The other one is fixed interval, is the scallop one. And that's because you've got something going on. Let me go back. Well, I can't go back right now. So fixed interval, is the scalloped one that has, it doesn't matter what you're doing in that time frame, then you hit the mark, and that's where your reinforcers. Variable interval is a steady rate, so that's why it's a flat rate, okay? And this is where, for instance, if you get a variable interval, again, the interval based on time, and now you're varying the time. So a variable interval of 30, the rats are reinforced only after 10 seconds, and then maybe after 30 seconds or 50 seconds, and then that average comes out to 30. So it does matter what they do in that time frame. It doesn't matter what they do in that time frame. It's always that time frame is always consistent. Okay, so this is a great example of this is parenting. When a child is whining, you're talking, off to the side here. Child's whining at you, and within maybe 10 seconds you respond like, no, mommy's talking, go away. And then you turn away, and then they start whining again, and you kind of ignore them this time. Then you turn around maybe in 30 seconds and go, sweetheart, I told you I'm talking, why don't we go find something to play with? Okay, and then turn around, have another conversation. You really ignore them for maybe a minute, and then really, okay, sweetheart, I really have told you. How can mommy help you? Let's, and so you're varying that time in which they're actually getting a reinforcement. They're getting an attention from you, even if it's negative attention, they're getting attention, but that time is varying. So that's why it sort of consistently looks like that. Okay, so those. Now, as we look at this, this is a good example of that on your sheet. Let's look at the examples here. We see that the first one, your instructor announces there'll be a surprise quiz over the course of the semester. Remember, this is based on time, and the quizzes are going to vary in terms of when you're going to give them. But in that time frame, you're getting the same amount of quizzes. You're getting 5. So it's variable interval because you're varying when the time is going to be. And the next one, it's fixed ratio because it's guided by behavior. Every 100 correct, you're getting a reward. So burst, pause, burst. And then beginning of the semester, the instructor announces there'll be a test every 2 weeks. So it's based on time and it's fixed. It's every 2 weeks. It's not varying like number 1. All right, number 4 is kind of hard. This one is variable interval as well because it says on average. Think about this. It's like, does the bus come from the bus stop exactly at 8:02, right? Let's say. No, it doesn't. And you're annoyed when it comes at 8:05 on the day that it's freezing and 8 o'clock on the day that you're late and you're trying to run to the bus stop. So that's why buses don't necessarily have an exact second or time. And so that's why it's variable interval based on time, and it varies. Next one is the slot machine. We talked about that being based on, slot machine, and it also varies when you get the actual reward and so forth. And then Miguel working its fixed interval, paid every Friday, and it's fixed, so it's a fixed time. It doesn't matter how much work he does within that time, he's still going to get paid on that afternoon. Okay, hope that makes a lot of sense. I gave you some more examples there that might help you on that. So let's go on to the contemporary view of operating conditioning, things that people found that were a little bit different from what Skinner found. One was you need to know these researchers' names, absolutely. Skinner especially, and also Bandura and Watson, but all the ones in between for the tests especially, you need to know who they are, what did they do, and what was the result of their research. So for Tolman, we have two particular vocab words with him, cognitive map and latent learning. And what Tolman said was he didn't believe that, it was only about reinforcement, that there was, it wasn't just a response to reinforcement and punishment that was guiding people and also animals. So he worked with rats and mazes. And he found, in just like a normal maze where they have a food at the end, he was making them try to find that and see how they would do if they were getting this reward. And he said the rats made a lot of mistakes and eventually got to the food, in which true behavioralists would talk about how that was a sequence of responses, turning here, not getting anything, and then eventually getting the food. But Tolman said he believed that people acquired knowledge and that they created a cognitive map, and that learning didn't have to be stamped in order for you to develop that acquired knowledge. And he saw this because he developed the idea of latent learning. He did a study with rats. The first group got rewards at the end of the maze with food, so they were making mistakes and they eventually got much better. The second group had no food reward at the end of the maze, and they made a ton of errors. So regular behaviorists would say, well, of course, because they didn't get the food at the end. The third group, however, he kind of delayed getting that reinforcement. So there was no food in the maze for the first 10 days, and then he put food at the end. And the 11th and 12th day, the rats just really caught on. So what he's saying was they didn't learn the map or learn the maze because there was a reinforcer. They just learned it. And because they got the reinforcer of food eventually, then it really came out that what they learned was actually observed. And so that's the idea of latent learning, that we have an acquisition of knowledge, and sometimes when we get a reinforcer, it actually comes out and we actually see it. Okay. The next one is by Martin Seligman, and he has learned helplessness. And this was interesting because he put some dogs in a shuttle box, and he was putting a tone with a shock and doing this classical conditioning grouping of that. And what he found was, as they were stuck there, a lot of the dogs just sat there. They didn't even try to do anything. They were very passive, and they didn't even try to jump over the wall of the shuttle box or anything. They just felt like it was inescapable. And you can see how this kind of idea would relate to depression and stress. And students feel this ways too. They feel like academics is not under their control, and then they shut down. They won't do anything. They just say, well, it's not out of my control. There's nothing I can do. I'm just going to fail anyway. And so establishing that control, because students have learned helplessness, is something that can help them to get out of that helplessness. They saw that by having students set goals and ask questions and so forth and get involved in their learning. And then they also dragged the dogs over the wall to show them, no, you can help yourself. You can get over and get away from this negative shock that you're having. So that's the idea of learned helplessness. And then finally is Keller and Maren Brenlin, who were oddly enough like training animals to do weird things. They wanted chickens to pull pulleys to swing a bat and then hit a ball, and so they were playing baseball, and they wanted the chickens to run the bases. Well, because the chickens are their predisposition biologically and evolutionary wise is to chase bugs, they were chasing the ball instead of running the bases. And the same with the raccoons that they had. They were having them dip a coin into or put coins to pick them up and put them in a box. Well, the raccoons didn't want to put them in the box. They wanted to dip them in the box, take them out. And that is a predisposition for them to dip their food in a lake or a stream to soften the food up before they eat it. And so what they found was we have the idea of instinctual drift, that they drifted away from what they were being taught to back to what their evolutionary species kind of predispositions were. And it kind of can mess up when you're conditioning something. Therefore, it makes it much easier to train an animal to do something much closer to what they normally do in the wild because they might have that instinctual drift to do something else. Okay, so that's all of operant conditioning. Let's go on to observational. You're going to do some things with this today. This one's one of the more fascinating ones as well. It gets into some really cool questions. Albert Bandura, he is one of the most famous psychologists. So just like William James or Freud or anything like that, or Skinner, you really need to know Bandura. And Bandura did not believe that reinforcers were the sole reason why people did what they did or animals do what they do. He believed it was because they were observing other people, okay? So he thought it was more indirect. Direct experiences more relate to classical and operant because you're learning, because you're experiencing a reinforcer. Indirect, you're kind of like observing kind of haphazardly, and then you kind of pick up on things. But he said there was actively judging and constructing these kinds of behaviors. It wasn't just copying and so forth. There's a processing of that information as well. So his famous experiment is called the Bobo doll experiment, and I have a video for you to watch just underneath this one so you can actually see what the experiment looked like. And he had children around the age of 4 years old. There was a range there. How they were going to watch a short film, and they had a series of different films that they were going to watch. There were 3 experimental groups that watched the films. One was more of the control group, and they're watching a film of an adult interacting with this Bobo doll. Now the Bobo doll is a blown up kind of clown looking thing. It has a weight at the bottom, so when you hit it, it kind of picks it, pitches back up. So you used to be able to like hit it and then it would come back up and you could play with it and so forth. So in the first group, the adults were hitting the doll with a hammer, yelling at it and so forth. Some of the groups that he had, he reinforced and so forth, and it made it even stronger than just observing it. And he reinforced them with soft drinks and candy and snacks, something that a 4-year-old would definitely like. In the second group, some of the adults were punished for their aggressive actions, and so they got a spanking or a scolding. So a spanking, maybe like a slap on the wrist, and then the kids could see somebody yelling at the adult. And then the aggressive actions had no consequences. And then they allowed the children to play with the Bobo doll to see how they would interact. So they definitely found, as you'll see in the video, that the children did imitate if a person was being aggressive and so forth, and especially if they had gotten a reward. However, some of the children afterwards were asked to imitate to go and play with the dolls, and what they found was an example of latent learning where they, let's say it was group B who did not have any adults being punished for their aggressive actions. Once the kids were given a reward, they went ahead and they had learned that aggressive action was something to do to the Bobo doll. And once they were given a reward, then it didn't matter what group they were in, they all showed aggressive behavior. So they all were acquiring knowledge, right, like Tolman said, but it didn't come out until there was actually a reward. Okay. So one of the things you're going to be doing next is looking at Bandura's cognitive processes. And one of the things he talks about is imitation. And in your book, it has some chart, but these are the main 4. And then there's a chart in your book that goes over some other things. For instance, imitating people of your own age, but it doesn't always have to be that way. It can be authority figures. If you see that they're doing something, classic example, when parents use bad language, so do their kids, and they do imitate that. So the 4 processes I'm going to have you look at is that the person needs to be paying attention. It has to be something that grabs their attention. It needs to be something that they can store in memory and be able to transform into actions. The mental images that you see can actually be performed by them, and it has to be somewhat motivating. So one of the things I'm going to have you do is look at a TV show, which in your book has talked about a lot of different cultural TV shows. Talks about like, is violence something that if you watch something violent, will that affect your behavior? Looking at shows like Friends and the 70s shows versus 16 and Pregnant, like what kind of behaviors can spawn off of those. And that's one of the things that you're going to do in your assignment, is to look at those and analyze those kind of shows and the information that you have. What the second thing you're going to do on that sheet that I have as an assignment is to look at a episode of Sesame Street. There's lots of cultural shows that have been shown. That in your book it talked about a Mexican show that dealt with literacy, a Kenyan show that had all these like social issues, and then a group out there like producing these kinds of educational shows. So I want you to look at the 4 different types of imitation, and I want you to see if you can figure out how Sesame Street actually is a good way of getting kids to imitate in a positive manner. Okay? All right, that's it for today, guys. Do that. You're going to be doing that last analysis sheet, and you'll be done, and then I will introduce the unit project just after that. All right, have a good day.